Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui, ko Sarah Mayo tōku ingoa. Hello everyone, I'm the Education Manager for the Education Hub, and it's my really great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's webinar. Before we begin, just a couple of details. The webinar will run for about 50 minutes, and it is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our website probably by the end of this week. I would also invite you to use the chat function to ask any questions you may have during the webinar, and I will do my best to work them into the conversation. And now it's my really great privilege to introduce tonight's guest, Dr. Vicky Hargraves, who, as most of you will know, is the Education Hub's early childhood specialist. And moreover, she is usually the person asking the questions. Before we get into the topic for tonight's webinar, I'm just going to ask Vicky to open with a karakia. Thanks, Vicky.
Yeah, Sarah. Tēnā koutou. Tūkua te wairua ki a rere ki ngā taumata te ārahi I a tātou mahi, me tā tātou whai I ngā tikanga a watu mā, ki a mau, ki a ita, ki a kore, ai e ngāro, ki a pūpuri, ki a whakamaua, ki a tīna, puli e taiaki. And that's just a little karakia. I'll read you the translation. Allow one spirit to exercise its potential to guide us in our work, as well as in pursuit of our ancestral traditions. Take hold and preserve it, ensure it's never lost. Hold fast, secure it, all together and firm. Yeah, Sarah.
Thank you, Vicky. Kia ora. So I'd just like to start tonight's webinar by giving you a little bit of a context as to why we've chosen this topic. So in 2023, the Education Hub conducted a survey to capture the experiences of neurodivergent students, their whānau, and the teachers and other professionals who support them in schools. We received an overwhelming response to this survey, but we also had a really large volume of emails asking why we weren't also addressing this topic at the early childhood level. So with this in mind, we have developed an online course, which is all about supporting neurodivergent children and their whānau in early childhood settings. And this course will be launching in a couple of weeks, so you can look out for information on it on our website. And so tonight's webinar is designed to share some of the insights and the ideas that have come out of the process of developing that course. So, Vicky, as we were developing the course, we had many discussions about how best to frame the ideas of neurodiversity and neurodivergence, given that with certain notable exceptions, not many conditions can be diagnosed within this age range. And even where they can be, many children will not have a diagnosis. And indeed, in many cases, a diagnosis is not desired by the family, nor is it necessarily even very useful in supporting kāko to know how to respond and what to do. So I wondered if we could start the kōrero tonight by putting a little bit of a shape around what we mean by a range of needs and how this aligns with the idea of neurodiversity.
Thank you, Sarah. I think firstly, I just want to start by saying that all children have needs. And I guess that's what I like about talking about a range of needs, because we all have needs, all the children that we teach have needs, and often I think these needs are the same. So, we have needs for, some basic care for our feed and sleep time, for rest, for exercise. But it might just be that for some of our children, these needs are met in not necessarily the same way. We also have needs for belonging, for being able to participate. Again, that's where, we might see real sort of range in the way that those needs can be met for different children. But I think it's really important to just remember that we all have needs, and to be a bit careful of phrases that imply that something over and beyond, such as the phrase additional needs. But we do know that there are children, for example, who may need to be tube fed, but they still have the same needs for nutrition. There may be children who need to wear a hearing aid in order to be able to participate and fully participate and to belong. But they still have that same need to participate, to belong, and I think it's important to recognise that commonality amongst all children. I think it's really easy to have this idea in our heads of kind of the normal child and the normal development that we would expect to see. And so those children with additional needs are already being set up as not normal, or even, you know, we might say abnormal. And when we think about it like that, we can immediately feel how that anguish would be it's quite a depressing way to talk about the children when we look at Te Whareki's aspiration statement in terms of competence and capability and confidence. These things don't seem to marry up too well. So I think a lot of this is about the image of the child, and particularly our image of the neurodivergent, or I maybe think of as a challenging child. And if we reframe this to say that everybody has these same needs, and we just need to find a way to meet these needs for each child, I think that can be a really helpful way. And one of the parents, I can't claim this comment for myself, it came from one of the parents that's involved in creating this course, but she said she didn't find it very useful to talk about the phrase neurotypical. So we have this idea that there is neurodiversity and that we all have different kinds of brains. So there's this sort of larger section of the population that are neurotypical, and that maybe they also come into that sort of lumping of being normal, having normal development, more normal brains. And I think she's probably right. It's not so useful to talk about neurotypical, because even within the realm of neurotypicality, there's still a lot of divergence and difference. But what we really want to do, I think, is get away from these words like additional needs that set up this kind of dichotomy, implies that there's this one way that suits most people, that is the right way to do things, until it's not the right way and it doesn't suit. But I do want to recognise too that there are children who might feel like they need more, perhaps they need different, they certainly maybe need different than what we're currently providing. And what we can notice, and what we might hear at this webinar tonight for, is because we've noticed that, you know, these children aren't thriving, and maybe they're even being disruptive and they're disrupting everybody else. Often when I talk to early childhood teachers, it's generally the impact that one child's behaviour is having on the rest of their group and the whole setting, and it can lead to a real sort of general sense of overwhelm. So I think we now know that this is principally a problem of regulation being the capacity to be calm and ordered in your thinking and your movement and expression of emotion. And regulation isn't easy, and it's not easy for a lot of people. It's certainly not learned in the early childhood years. It takes many, many years. And we definitely, none of us are really good at regulating our behaviour and our communication and our emotions when we're feeling a bit out of sorts in our environment. But yeah, I want to acknowledge that it can be really difficult to work with children who are dysregulated. And I guess that's what the course is about, helping children to feel safe, secure and happy. Because, you know, otherwise I think working with children that are really dysregulated is incredibly draining for our own nervous systems. And so we can't get into the cycle where, you know, it's exhausting trying to support this child. The child's upset, the teachers are upset. I also have a personal interest because I have an autistic son who is now 11. But I can still say now that I find his moments of dysregulation really exhausting. Like just this week, we went to the supermarket, which he doesn't normally come with me. He usually avoids it, but this time he came and he was totally dysregulated the whole time. He was jigging, he was sweating, he was really, really stressed. There were 2 boxes of eggs left on the shelf, and when I took them for our shopping trolley, he was really upset. He was really anxious that we shouldn't have taken the last 2 boxes of eggs. And then he wanted some mints, but he wasn't sure which ones. There were 2 kinds that he liked. I mean, you know, he gets so dysregulated, he might get tearful, or he might shout, or he might storm off. And I come home absolutely shattered, totally uptight. I've forgotten half the things that I wanted to buy. So it is really challenging. These situations are really challenging. But what we need to move towards is how do we support our children to feel as safe and secure and as regulated as they can for as much of their time in the setting as they can.
Thank you, Vicky. So I just want to build on that a little bit and ask about some of the approaches that we have had in the past to supporting autistic children. And these approaches have often involved using a particular range of strategies to target children's perceived deficits. So I wanted to ask, why do you think it's important that we move beyond this type of approach in the early childhood years?
I think that's a really good question, because something that's really important to be aware of. I think when we're aware of this, reflective on it sort of loses its power. But we've sort of had this model where neurodivergence has been seen as a disease. It's come from the medical model, and well-intentioned, I imagine, in that, you know, here's a child with a problem and let's see if we can fix it. But this is where the kind of interventions and supports that have come in have been things like trying to correct someone's eye contact, to make them give proper eye contact, or just giving a child to say hello in the morning as being a target sort of behaviour that the interventions have really sought to achieve. And then we've moved on from this medical model somewhat, in that instead of seeing the disease or the condition being located in the child, a social disability model was put forward, which really meant that it was the social environment who who made that person disabled. So we know this pretty well with the idea of someone in a wheelchair, or a child using a walking frame, and they can't, for example, go up some steps into the centre, so we can adapt that that disabling environment. We can adapt it by putting in a ramp, for example, or if you have a child with dwarfism who can't maybe reach to play in the water table, you know, you can offer steps and remove that disability by the way that you modify the environment. The environment is the thing that is actually disabling children. And I guess that happens with my son too, when he goes on a shopping trip. It's supermarkets in particular have very bright lights. They have lots of people, lots of sounds, the humming lights, and also the fact there are so many colourful mints to choose from. All of that is very disabling for him. So with that in mind, we stopped seeing the problems being located in the child and this condition, and started seeing that maybe there were some ways that we could modify the world so that people could fit better. And this is where the neurodiversity movement comes in, by recognising, as we do with all kinds of different diversities, you know, gender diversity and cultural diversity, we have neurodiversity, which means that the differences in the way that our brains work and the kind of environments we prefer is just seen as a natural form of difference, normal, natural, and to be celebrated. Just like we want that diversity of plants in our garden, and just like we really find it enriching when we have the diversity of cultures in our early childhood centres. So there's value in the differences. And we know that often people who have some form of neurodivergence might have a different way of responding to their senses, as for my son at the supermarket. But so someone who's incredibly sensitive to smell and taste, you know, they will use those skills to become, in a later career, to become an amazing chef or a wine tester. Or someone who's very particular about the way that things are done might be an amazing wedding planner at some later point. And someone who cares so much about the number of eggs that are left on the shelf for the next person might be a social justice warrior. There's all sorts of positives when we look at these differences through a different lens. And I think it's really important to ask ourselves why we feel that we need to correct something in somebody else, and how it would feel to be someone who other people look at and say, well, we need to fix that. I think we really need to come back to Manakitanga and the mana affirming and mana enhancing approach that Te Whāriki really encourages us in. And, you know, this is for all children, but maybe even more so for these children who are already sometimes marked out as being that bit different and not fitting the norms of development that we expect. And we also have a really strong human rights ethic in Aotearoa in New Zealand, and there is children's right to decide, you know, who they're going to be and how they're going to belong. And I think if their behaviour or their manner of engaging in the world isn't actually upsetting anyone else, we probably don't really have the right to decide that it needs correcting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. So just picking up on, you know, those frameworks that you've talked us through, the medical model of disability, and then contrasting that with the social model and the neurodiversity paradigm. All of that makes a lot of intuitive sense, but it's actually quite a lot of work to really unpack those kinds of frameworks. So why do you think that it's important for kaiako to really critically interrogate their thinking and their assumptions around developmental differences and diagnostic labels?
I think firstly I ought to just offer a little caveat, which is that labels can be useful because they can offer us clues into what a child needs. But as you said at the beginning of this webinar, often we don't even have these diagnostic labels for children until they are several years old. And I certainly didn't for my son, but I have to say that the labels were very useful to give me a sort of a bit of a hook into understanding who he was. But I still had to do an awful lot of learning about him as an individual person who was autistic, but was, you know, had his own version of that, I suppose, and that even learning what fits other autistic children didn't always fit him. So he's not this, you know, sort of typecast autistic boy. And we have to just be careful whenever we pigeonhole children with a label, any kind of label, but also a neurodivergent label, because then we might start seeing that sort of autism or FASD, which is the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We start seeing that rather than seeing them as a unique person with a range of differences that aren't all comprised in that label. So again, it's coming back to that image of the child. And also I think it's important because when children have labels, and especially if special funding comes attached to that label, we can sometimes start offering different things for children who are different, which is equitable, I agree, but is it actually inclusive? I think that's the big question we need to be asking ourselves. A really obvious example is making an exception for a child who finds sitting still difficult. So you might have a child at that time who finds it really difficult to sit still. And that might be because they have a sensory processing need for sensory input about where they are in space. They actually need to move to find out what's going on with their body. And what we want to do is to accommodate the diverse needs of our children without marking them out as needing something different. So like the wheelchair ramp for the child, maybe needed a walking frame or a wheelchair. Anybody can walk up the ramp. The ramp is just there. It's not marked out as being only for Sarah. And putting a stool or some steps in some various locations around the centre for a child with autism just to help them to reach things. Again, they're just there. They just become part of the environment. So if we want to excuse a child from mat time, one child from mat time, give them something else to do because they can't manage, it's slightly the word we use, they can't manage mat time, then an inclusive practice is to make that the norm, like the wheelchair ramp, like the steps, just something that is there for all children and not the exception. It's when we mark out children as needing something different from everyone else that we actually start to threaten their sense of belonging and what we're really wanting for children. Well, early childhood curriculum is all about is this well-being and belonging. So it's thinking about how that might be. And children are so astute, of course, they soon work out that Sarah's excused from that time. She's not quite capable. She's not as good at sitting as they are. They pick up on these messages and there becomes a little bit of a social hierarchy, and then we're the ones that can and you're the one that can't. So you know, we have to be really aware of how astute children are with those messages. What we really want to do with the supports that we offer children is say that give all of this in the realm of, you know, all of this is in the realm of this is normal, this is okay. If you need a tube to eat food, if you need a ramp to enter the building, if you need big movement rather than a sedentary mat time, all of that is okay and can be catered for in our setting. So inclusion, I think, is just really important to remember. Key ideas about inclusion are about ensuring that each child feels a sense of belonging, feels well-being, and is able to participate in the same way that everybody else. And if children aren't made to look different or worse, or made to look deficient or incapable, you know, any of that will not support well-being and belonging, and it won't help their participation.
Yeah, thank you. And you make such a powerful point there, which is about how complex it can be to be genuinely inclusive in a way that recognises and responds to children's needs without the stigma that can be attached to those responses. So it's really complex work. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you would recommend as an approach that Kaiako can take to develop their practice around supporting children with a range of needs.
Sure. Well, I think really it's all relational, meaning that it is about getting into a relationship with children and finding out what works for them, what doesn't work for them, what makes them feel upset, what makes them feel scared. These children, in my experience, can be pretty sensitive and reactive, but you can't support a child to be at their best until you know what it is that stresses them, what reduces their capacity to act well. It's really important to know that all children want to act well. They actually want to please adults. And sometimes we wonder what's going on with the child, but they also are wondering, why am I behaving like this? Too. They really want to be doing the right thing, but something is preventing that for them. So it's about finding those little differences you can make that will make a big difference to their capacity to participate and to be sort of calm and to be self-regulated as much as possible, as much as we can, is developmentally appropriate at this age. So there are little differences, little things that we can do that make a big difference. And of course, a strong relationship with an adult in the setting is a very important, safe and secure base. As we know from our practice of infants and toddlers, that safe and secure base is crucial. It's the beginning of learning. So that's always where to go back to start and use those relational pedagogies. Relational pedagogy just means putting relationships at the heart of your practice. And that's what we are doing all the time in early childhood education. So we're actually in this amazing space where we know how to build relationships with children. We may need to make some adjustments for children with different expectations of relationships, different preferences for relationships. But it is really what at the heart of our curriculum is. We're not doing this on top of. This is what we're doing all the time. And that's really empowering for us as teachers. What we have to be really careful of is that we have been subject to these kind of narratives around the medicalisation of neurodivergence and how certain children will need certain things in order to be able to achieve and develop properly. So we have to be really critically reflective about those messages. And maybe just try and get rid of some of our normative assumptions, which suggest that, all of our children should be able to sit on the mat quietly. And as I said, maybe build relationships differently, and remembering as well that it's, the child's right to be who they are and for their identity to be celebrated and valued in the early childhood setting, rather than us trying to change that identity to something that fits and what we feel is appropriate for a child of that age. And just another point, that relational pedagogy also means focusing strongly on relationships with whānau and with each other. So whānau have got a lot to offer us in terms of seeing another perspective on the child. There may be different things, there may be behaviours that don't happen at home because the trigger's different. There might be they might know a lot more about calming techniques for children. And also with each other, we need to support each other because this is really demanding work. And we need to be able to step in and out of situations that maybe challenge our regulations, because like me in the supermarket.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And just a reminder to everyone watching, if you have got any questions, please feel free to use the chat function and type them in. I would just ask, though, that nobody asks any questions about specific children or it gives too much detail about any particular child that you might be working with. So I wanted to pick up on that idea of relational pedagogy, Vicky, because, the encouraging thing about this as an approach is that, as you say, this is what early childhood teachers already do. This is absolutely at the heart of their practice and the way that they work. But I think it can also be useful for kaiako to build their knowledge and their understanding about some of the differences and some of the challenges that children may experience in the early years. You've touched on some of these already, for example, around sensory processing. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about some of those areas where it can be really valuable for kaiako to build their knowledge.
Thank you. Just to reiterate as well that what you said before about, not much is diagnosed. before age 5, except perhaps maybe some autism or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. If there's been some disclosure of that, then those things might be apparent to Kayapul, but we'll come back to those in a moment, I think, because I think really your point is really a good one, that we actually need to know in what ways can our brains, our children's brains be different? What might be some of these differences and what might they look like? And then that is how we then know how to put in some supports that are going to help. So we don't need to know the different conditions so much. Our job isn't about diagnosis anyway, but we do need to know about some of these neurodevelopmental differences and things like sensory processing differences, whether that you find those in children with autism, FASD, ADHD, all these things, they all have an element, DCD, they all have an element of sensory processing differences. So if we learn about sensory processing differences, then it doesn't really matter so much whether we know what the specific condition is. It's definitely not our role. So what we're looking at is focusing on where we might see brain-based differences. And it's really, I guess, 4 main areas where we might see differences. One is sensory processing. And going back to that idea that I said before, that we all have needs, we all have very different sensory needs too. So some of us, and maybe you can reflect now while you're listening, some of us actually really prefer quieter spaces and actually can't think very well if we're in a noisy environment. And others, my sister has to have the TV on all the time, but she loves a bit of background noise. She just finds it really disconcerting for things to be quiet. And this is true for everyone in the population. We all have a different sort of tolerance level, different sensory experiences. So sensory processing includes the way that we process 5 senses that we're very familiar with: our sight, our smell, our taste, our hearing and touch. But there are also internal senses like interoception, which is internal voice telling you you're hungry, when your muscles are tired. We have proprioception, which is telling you where you are in space, what your body, different parts of your body are doing, feeling how much force you're using to lean back on a chair or to push something. And we have a vestibular sense, which is about our balance, and all of those things can vary in the amount of input that the brain is able to receive and kind of process. So some children are getting more sensory input than they can deal with, and some children aren't getting enough. So it's vast. You can see how complex this becomes. So many different senses, and so many that nobody's the same, and that they're getting a load of input in one sense, in every single sense. That we're getting a lot of input in one sense, but a lot less in another sense, perhaps. So there's some really complicated patterns to this. But if we know that sensory processing is something to look at, just observe whether our children, how comfortable our children are with noise, with crowds, with lights, things like that. Another area where we see brain-based differences is in executive function, which is a sort of a big word, which includes kind of higher level thinking that our brains are able to do, which is kind of like to pay attention, to be flexible in our thinking, to sort of move from one thing to another when we're asked. Working memories, so being able to hold an instruction that you've just given a child for them to be able to hold it in mind for a certain period of time. And also inhibition, which can be a big one in terms of wanting to hit out and being able to hold that feeling in, or not acting on your impulse to do something. So some children might have lower working memory, and when you give a load of verbal instructions, they simply can't retain them. It's just a brain-based thing. There's nothing they can do about this. They need our support in terms of maybe one instruction at a time, or a visual cue, so that they can be supported to remember this piece of information that you need them to remember. Things like attention can be really different for children with for autistic children who can be really, really good at sort of like a spotlight kind of attention, where they're really, really focused on one thing. Whereas another pattern of attention is to have a real diffuse sense of attention, a bit more like sunlight, and that you're able to attend to a variety of things going on around you. And this is why we find our autistic children can really struggle with something like the transition, which is executive functions. So being able to be flexible enough to stop doing this and start doing that. That can be really difficult when your attention is really tightly focused on something. So I think this is where it's, helped me so much, is having an understanding of what it might be like to be inside one of these brains. And to see, how different the world looks for this child than it is for you. It can explain so much, I think. Another area where we might see brain-based differences that are due to the way the brain is built and is being connected up, is in motor planning. There's so much involved in making any movements. You need to know what you want to do, you need to know the steps involved, you need to know the order of the steps, how much force to use, how fast or slow to perform the movement. And all the time you need to monitor how you're going, you need to adapt your movement. If you're trying to put your arm into the sleeve of your jacket and you're getting your elbow caught somewhere, you need to adjust the movement of your arm. And for some children, those things are really big. And so, often they're getting into trouble or feeling that they inept, that they don't really know how to fix it either. So it's why I really think it's so important to use that manner harnessing approach as much as we can. And finally, I think one that a lot of early childhood practical will be aware of is that speech and language differences. I think we're all pretty aware that if you don't have the language to communicate that you want a toy, you might use another kind of behaviour to grab the toy, or something maybe that's not so appropriate. But everyone does learn to speak differently in a different time frame. And even things like stuttering, those things can just sort of disappear over time. And they don't necessarily affect language difference. And some differences like echolalia, which is where people just repeat back the words. Children will spend quite a bit of time in echolalia where they just repeat back words you say to them as if they're not really understanding. But this has actually been found to be a way into verbal language development. So it's really important to be aware that the differences aren't necessarily negative. They might just be simply a different way of coming into language or coming into movement. They also might be things that children need more support with. So I recommend a relational approach, because we really need to be aware of what is it that's going to support our children, what is it that they most want support with. I think it's just most important to be affirming of children's attempts, to really see the child as trying to do their best all the time, and not necessarily ensuring that children sort of meet our normative standards, things like eye contact or walking, falling, walking at a particular age. Some children can do just fine with that in the learning. Just need to be aware, I think. Aware and very reflective about these things. Have I got time to say something a little bit about just autism? And
yeah, please do. Yeah.
Well, I think what we know about autism, without trying to paint this very broad picture that's going to fit with children, but we do know there's likely to be some social differences in terms of the way that children choose to interact with others. There will be some sensory processing differences and some attention differences. And those attention differences can spill over into things like flexibility, as I mentioned, making transitions. With fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, which is again where some brain-based differences come into play because of alcohol-induced brain damage in utero. We might see language comprehension differences, which you might be quite adept at expressing themselves verbally, but not always understanding everything that we're saying to them. And actually, in the way that children always want to please, just saying yes, even though they haven't understood necessarily what we said. That's another thing to be wary of. They might need more support with working memory and just processing language generally, just giving them more time to process the language and their thinking. And I guess understanding all of this as a brain-based event so the child has no control over means it's so important that we're not disciplining children, we're not using punitive measures to try and teach them correct behaviours. Because that means we're being punitive towards the behaviour of neurodevelopmental difference. We just have to assume that children are doing that, as they really are.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Vicky. That's really helpful. And I would just add at this point that the course that we have developed does go into all of these areas that Vicky's just been speaking about. in more detail. So there is a lot of information in the course to help you build your knowledge and your understanding of some of those brain-based differences. And one of the other things that we've done when we developed this course that is a little bit different to what we've done in the past is that we have based it around a series of case studies of real children. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about why the decision was made to design the course in this way, rather than perhaps focusing on different forms of neurodivergence like autism and FASD that you've just described, and then the strategies that teachers should be using to support children with those particular diagnoses. So tell us why we've designed the course in the way that we have.
Sure. I think it just comes down to that really key principle here. There's no one size fits all. There's no one thing that can make, as we know this intuitively, there's no one thing that makes a child feel safe. For all the children that we've ever taught, we've probably always found, you know, each child to be an individual. So what makes one child feel safe and able to participate is something really different for each child that we meet. Neurodivergent. But with neurodivergent children, we might be supporting sensory differences, a bit more maybe reducing some sensory input so they don't feel constantly agitated and overwhelmed, or increasing sensory input so they can really understand what's going on in their environment a bit more. You know, maybe they need a bit of really active movement to sort of wake up their nervous system and get really attending. It might be that instructions need to be broken down or presented visually in the case of just language comprehension, or just simple things like having a buddy next to them to watch. They're not sure how to work through the sequence of washing hands that I talked before about, you know, the number of different things you have to do. Just think through the sequence of washing hands, and the teacher says, go wash your hands. All right, I don't know. You know, for a child just to have a buddy that they can copy and work through step by step. First it's this step, then it's that step. You know, it's just going to be really, really helpful. And we're just trying to reduce that overwhelm, that sort of niggly feeling of fear that comes up for a child and they just don't know what they're meant to be doing. So it's going to be different for every single child, and that's why we didn't decide to have sections on autism, because that would imply that this is what you do for an autistic child. I have an autistic child, and some of the stuff I've mentioned before, some of the strategies wouldn't work for him. So we often think that autistic children would benefit from a visual timetable. Well, he would be, that really would not work for him. He has some other things going on, the way that he processes information and thinks about who he is in the world, that just wouldn't fit. So what we're trying to say in the course is, here are some, you know, real children. These are the things that work for them. These are the things that make them different, and that you would think about as a teacher, and this is how we're going to make them feel a sense of belonging, a sense of well-being, and feeling really confident to participate in our own childhood setting without marking them out as being different. But that is, you know, what we're doing is trying to offer a range of strategies and a range of things that could be going on for children that you might need to think about. But you have to take that information away. You have to build the relationship with the child and their environment, and you just have to try and see what works. And really, I really encourage you to feed into your intuition of what's working, and what's feeling good, what makes this child feel good, what makes you feel good. Is that kind of working with them? Yeah, we just didn't want to play into that medical model, medicalization, saying here's a child with autism, and this is what we're going to do to fix these behaviours, these symptoms, and we really wanted to sort of push against child development norms and really sort of trust in children's agency a bit more than we have done perhaps for neurodivergent children in the past. Yeah, so we don't have a section of the course on autism, but we do feature children who, you know, are autistic. But it's really though that we want to prioritise that relational approach. Really want to just look at how do we support belonging, how do we support participation, rather than more of this child's symptoms, or what does that mean in terms of what condition they might have. Yeah, really just wanted it to be neurodiversity affirming as well, and see all children as unique individuals that can be capable and confident in their sense of identity.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, some of the stories, some of the children that all of the children we feature in the course actually are really just quite remarkable individuals, and the stories are all really powerful. I wondered if I can pick up a little bit on what you've been saying about relational approaches and relational pedagogies, and maybe because we've got a wee bit of time, just talk a little bit more about the idea of regulation, dysregulation, because often, as you said earlier in the webinar, it's the dysregulation piece that people tend to notice. But actually, if you are taking a relational approach, you are much more likely to tune in to all the many signs and triggers that might be leading up to a child reaching that point where they become dysregulated, where they're highly distressed and they have that really sort of outward expression of that dysregulation. But we know that it very rarely goes straight to that. There's a lot that happens beforehand. So I wondered if you could maybe just talk a little bit more about how taking that really relational approach will help teachers to tune in to some of the things that might be building up in a child and leading towards that sort of dysregulated response.
Maybe if we think about times when we feel dysregulated, it happens to us all. And I think that just that idea that somebody on your side, there's somebody that you can turn to, I think it's about that same secure base that we know that infants need and that all children need. They need to be able to feel that there's someone who can come into their world and make something stop. Often when they're really dysregulated, they just want you to stop. I think that it's, as you said, it's not one thing maybe that leads to this dysregulated behaviour, and it's a multitude of things that have built up and built up and built up. And that's been that actually makes it hard, because it can seem like the simplest thing has set this child off, and we haven't been able to see, and probably could see, the sort of the build up from when they got out of bed in the morning and their breakfast was soggier, cereal was soggier than they like to have it, and mum said there wasn't time to change it, and all these little things that and again, to empathise with, soggy cereal, is it that big a problem? But to really see this, I think if you think about some of these sensory differences, particularly around food, if someone's to put worms on your plate and ask you to eat them, you have this kind of reaction that, and that is just as valid and as real as what our children are experiencing if they have these sensory aversions. I know I've been really frustrated with my son being really dysregulated in the middle of the night when I'm exhausted, and he's explained that he can, because now he's 11 and he can articulate this a bit more, which gives me an advantage. It was much harder in the early childhood years. He can hear cockroaches running around, he can hear water in the pipes, everything just seems so loud and intimidating and stressing him out. And when I'm aware of that, I can be more empathetic. And I think that's again where a relational approach comes in, because I don't think that we can ever really remove these dysregulated behaviours, but if we can kind of understand them and see that, this challenging behaviour is behaviour that we are finding challenging for them, it's just communication. But they're not being willfully trying to challenge us. They are really just struggling to cope. So I think that the relational approach, can help us. If we really know children at a deep level, we might be able to notice small body movements and gestures that indicate that it's just, a little tug on the hair or rub of an ear, just little things that's starting to build for them. And we can maybe move them to a space that is really calming and regulating, can maybe preempt. And I know this is really difficult in an early childhood setting, but it's really worth putting this effort into the relationship. And also the relationship should be the thing to help when children are dysregulated and really need help to calm down. This is when all we can do is offer them safe space to vent those feelings and to accept that this is something that, they really have reached the point where they can't cope and they need to vent, and to allow that partner to be the person that's there supporting and not judging, and just saying something like that was really hard for you, I get it, and helping them to calm, feel safe again, and move on. But I realise this is really really challenging work, and I think the younger our children are, the more smart we have to be about observing these very small differences.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think also, you know, what we've talked about a little bit of, in terms of building a bit more knowledge around some of the sensory differences, about executive functioning differences, and understanding some of those things that to us might look very innocent, that to a child can be really, really incredibly difficult to cope with. I think the more we build our knowledge and understanding, the easier it will be to observe some of those things that might be just starting to build up the stress for that child in ways that we might not typically expect. I wonder if I can throw another question at you, Vicky. This is not one that we planned, but it sort of, again, it arises from the idea of relational pedagogies, and it's to do with different kind of cultural conceptualizations of neurodiversity. And I wondered if maybe you might talk a little bit. You've mentioned that you found when you initially got your son's diagnosis of autism, you mentioned that you found that really useful as a starting point, but that since then, we've discussed in the past that you found the idea of takiwatanga to be ultimately a much more useful conceptualization for thinking about your son than the autism diagnosis. So I wondered, could you just maybe talk a little bit more about that and how this sort of moving from the autism to the notion of takiwatanga really helped you to understand how to support your son a little bit better?
Yeah, I actually thought about this when I read our translation for it out here, which asked us to guide us in our work, but also to pursue our ancestral traditions. So I'm not Māori, I'm Pākehā, but Pākehā New Zealander that is very passionate to learn. And I think that there are some amazing kaupapa, I suppose, from and values from our Māori traditions in this country that can be really useful, and that is the idea of the child as this taonga who's just a real treasure, who is really trusted and seen as having mana from the moment that they are born. And although there hasn't been a word for autistic children in the early history of Māori settling in Aotearoa, but there has been a word that's been coined since to reflect this idea that you know, all children have gifts, all children are a gift, and so if that's the case, then what is the gift of our neurodivergent children? And so for takiwatanga, it's about being able to kind of tune into a different realm. I guess it picks up on the sensory processing differences, and that maybe even those executive function differences in terms of being able to look at that spotlight rather than that. Yeah, so our takiwatanga can bring so much strength to our group because they have these insights and these special ways of seeing the world that aren't actually, this is what I liked about it, they aren't actually accessible to people without an autistic brain. So sort of, it's sort of, I guess it's kind of that superpower thing that we can say. I think it's really important not to gloss over, we need to acknowledge the difficulties that some people can have in our society, perhaps as a result of the way that we have organised society around them. But yeah, I do love the term. I do think that it's not related to the medical model at all. It's not seen as a condition that can be cured or should be cured. You know, there are people looking for a cure for autism, for example. I'm not going to go into, you know, that's quite a political thing, but it's just important to know that there are some words that we can use that are really outside of that medicalisation of these as things that need to be fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I particularly love, obviously we're not talking about ADHD at all in this age group, but I particularly love the Te Reo Māori term for ADHD, which is aroreretini, which means attention goes to many things, which is a really kind of positive and affirming conceptualization, especially when you sit it alongside a diagnosis like ADHD, which has the word deficit and the word disorder in it. So I particularly love that. Okay, so we are coming towards the end of our time this evening, but I wondered, Vicky, if we could just sum up this really wonderful kōrero that you've shared with us by asking, why is all of this so important?
I think that we want our children to feel confident and capable. That's actually our mission. That's our aspiration statement of Te Whare. And they are. These children, our neurodivergent children, are just as capable and confident can be. Their challenging behaviour is challenging for us, as I said before, but they're not deliberate. I don't know if we should something to reflect on whether we keep using that term, because they're not deliberately challenging us. That can be somehow how it's perceived that this child is just driving me crazy. Why do I have to say things 3 times? Well, it might be a really good reason why you're saying things 3 times to this child. But it's not willful behaviour. The children are doing, all our children are doing as best as they can every day. And sometimes when those dysregulated moments happen and children do some really outrageous things because of the intensity of what they're feeling, they're behaving outside of their own values, and they can be mortified by their own actions and actually feel kind of a lot of shame afterwards. We can contribute to that if we decide to evaluate their choices with them, so again, just, that was really hard, maybe that was a bit too hard, is a great comment to come in with for a child who's been really dysregulated. Sort of excusing them, allowing them to not get it right all the time. Otherwise, it's been found in research that it can lead to long-term mental health conditions for people that are neurodivergent and sort of experience a lot of shaming throughout their education, and that's much more difficult to manage than the pre-existing neurodivergent differences. I think it's just most important that what we want for our children to learn in early childhood education is just that this early childhood setting, is a safe place for them to be themselves, where their participation is valued and wanted, and where they can learn in their own way and at their own time. I think basically if we can just move to thinking less about challenging behaviour and thinking more about dignity for the child, safety for the child, and I think we're on the right track.
Yes, thank you. That is a really lovely note to end on. So thank you, Vicky, and thank you so much for sharing all your incredible knowledge and insight, both from your work and your research, but also from your personal experience. So thank you. I really, really appreciate everything that you've shared with us this evening. And I wonder, one last thing, can I ask you to close us with a karakia tonight?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me on to talk about something I'm so passionate about. And here is a karakia from the Tēnei te huina o te tangata whaoki, tēnei te mauri te wānanga kami. Ko te nākau mi te wairoa ki a wātia, ko te tingana mi te hinanaro ki a tā, whānau, haere mai te toki, hui e, taiki. This gathering of people will now rest, our deliberations and discussions suspended. The heart and soul are free to rejuvenate. Very important, I have to say, when you're working with neurodivergent children. The body and mind has time to relax. May these words go and move into conclusive actions for you when you're limited and ready. Kia ora.
Thank you, Vicky. Kia ora, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening for this webinar. Pō Mārie.
Mārie.